My name is Bob Brown, and I think I know many of you who are signing on. I'm with SHN. I'm the principal planner, and joining us today is Ethan Lawton, also with SHN. I wanted to share some of the upcoming events. And so today is the Tribal Sovereignty, and August 11th, Elizabeth Burks from Waco and Associates will be presenting on the role of planners in promoting equity. We also have on September 8th, Christine Legg from the Deputy County Clerk's Office, the Recorder's Office, on how to file and retrieve recorded documents. October 13th will be the third session of Ethan's presentations on tribal lands, the difference between fee and trust lands, and some other topics, which he will go into a little bit more detail today. And November 10th will be David Loya from the city of Arcata talking about the Creamery District Gateway Project. So that should have gone out to our APA AEP distribution MailChimp list. If you're not on the list, you could go ahead and contact Ethan afterwards, and we'll keep you informed on future events. So with having said that, I will let Ethan continue on. And Ethan, you ready? You're muted.
There we go. Yatte heyan kamalia hoya tistel tuito anote. Welcome, my family. I'm glad to be here today with you, and I want to start off first by acknowledging that where we're streaming this from is in Arcata, and we're on the ancestral lands of the Wiyot tribe, and so I wanted to acknowledge them in that. And I also like to start off with a short prayer, so if you'll join me, I'll pray. Oh, great Creator, thank you for this time and this day that we can gather together. Give us wisdom and understanding, and give us peace and unity. And amen. All right, so I'll get started. I put this PowerPoint together. Let me see. My clicker's not working. There it is. So a little bit about me. My name's Ethan. My family name is Lawton. My native name is Red Eagle. I was born in Anchorage, Alaska, and I'm 4/4 Native American. And 1/4 of it is Inupiaq, and that's a subset of Inuit. We're in the northwestern Alaska region. My family's village is Kotzebue. It's a very isolated village. You can only get there by plane, boat, or dog sled. There are no roads connecting it. Also, I'm a 1/4 Sioux, specifically Lakota. We're located in the Dakotas, and we're part of the 7 Council Fires. We have a population of about 150,000, and our clan is about 70,000. I'm also a 1/4 Navajo, part of the Bitterwater clan. We're located in the Four Corners. We call ourselves Dene, although we're popularly known as Navajo. We have about 400,000 members, and we have a 17.5 million acre reservation, quite large. I'm also a 1/4 Thona'atam. We're located in the southern Arizona region. My family's village is Gatka, and we're formerly known as Papago. We have about 28,000 members and 2.8 million acres of a reservation, and my family village is quite small. There are probably 80 of us. Part of my experience, I have about 13 years of intercultural specialists professionally under my belt, about only 8 years of tribal liaison experience, and I've been with SHN for 4 years, over 4 years now. Professionally, I've worked with over 50 tribes and visited over 100 reservations throughout the nation and have worked with over 150 different tribal members from different tribes.
Okay, so we come to our first polling question, which is, what is the proper tribal terminology? So this is a multiple choice, and go ahead and just to experience this event, go ahead and give a guess. So let's give it another 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. I should mention that you won't be graded on this, so feel free to guess. All right, so here is our shared results. I have a question. Maybe somebody can just chat. Can you see the shared results?
No. Yes.
Okay. How about someone from our audience? Can you just, someone type in yes or no? Okay,
Yes.
looks like we got yeses. Okay.
All right. So the 15% said Native American, 15% said First Nations, 15% said Indigenous, 4% said Native American, and 78% said all of the above. This was a trick question. The correct answer is all the above. The proper terminology, the common terminology is based on region. Native American is most popularly used here on the West Coast. First Nations is popularly used in the northern states, and that's primarily influenced from Canada. Indigenous is used well in the southern states, bordering Mexico, because it's more of a South American influence of Indigenous. And American Indian is most commonly used on the East Coast. A lot of the federal laws and rules use American Indian. And so all four of these are common and different. And it's the most common term is based upon what region you're in or where the origin of it is based. Just so you can have that nugget of knowledge. So as we move on, let me see if I can move on. There we go. So a few disclaimers before we dive into it. I'm not speaking on behalf of all the tribes. This is general information for the purposes of your services for tribal communities, purely for the intention of improving government-to-government relationships. For more specific tribal government information, it should be provided by a member of that particular tribe. Second disclaimer is this is for training and general educational purposes only. It's not intended for legal advice, although there is some legal stuff in here. I encourage all legal inquiries be shifted to California Indian Legal Services. We have a great partnership with them, and I highly recommend them for any kind of legal services. This is part of a six-part series. Many of you may have joined for the cross-cultural etiquette that was provided last year. This is the second component, tribal sovereignty, tribal government. As Bob mentioned earlier, there'll be tribal lands covered later this year in October. Tribal consultation is another coming component, as well as cultural mitigations and tribal confidentiality. So those are some topics that I'll briefly touch on today, but we'll go more in depth at a later date. So this is kind of the outline of the presentation. I'll be covering tribal history first, tribal recognition status, tribal government structure and function, source and limitations, and government-to-government best practices. There is a lot of material that I'll be covering, and I'll try and cover it as briefly and as condensedly as possible. I can honestly talk about this pretty much all day, but I'll give you the boiled down version due to the brevity of time. Some of this might be common knowledge like it is for me, but with my many discussions, it may not be common knowledge. Some of it may even be a surprise to you. But I'll do my best not to talk any politics today, but primarily rely on constitutional, federal, state, and tribal law, as well as Supreme Court determinations. So the first part, tribal history. I'm not sure how extensive your knowledge is in tribal history, whether you took it in grade school, high school, higher education, or on your own studies, but to better understand tribal sovereignty, I included a brief portion of it today. So I've broken it down into groupings of dates. The first part is known as tribal independence. This covers dates from 1492 to 1787. And I included groupings of dates because the relationship with tribes and the federal government almost hinges on a pendulum. And I included some important points. Christopher Columbus is one factor in the relationship of what is common day federal government with the tribes. And so that's kind of started the relationship. Jamestown in 1607, we see settlers from England, France, Spain, Netherlands, all along the eastern seaboard. And there were numerous wars. We have the Peregrine War, English and tribes versus Peregrine tribe in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And then we have wars with Dutch and the Delaware Indians. We have the King Philip's War between English tribes and the Wampanoag Confederate tribes. We have the French and Indian Wars, and of course the American Revolution, which involved numerous tribes as well. So we see that the pendulum started out kind of mixed, and we see the pendulum swing in favor of tribes. We have the Constitution of the United States in 1776. The founders regarded Indian tribes as having both the right and the ability to govern their own people as sovereign nations and to make treaties and to declare war. I'll go more in depth on this later on. We also see the Northwest Ordinance, one of the first acts of Congress, which declared the utmost good faith shall always be observed towards Indians. Their land and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. This was one of the first acts of Congress. And then we see in 1793, there was a statute that was passed that prohibited non-Indians from settling on Indian lands, prohibited federal employees from trading with Indians, and exempted Indians from complying with state trade regulations. Also in 1823, the Office of Indian Affairs was created within the War Department. Then we see the pendulum swing in favor of towards against tribes. 1830 was the Indian Removal Act. This was encouraged by President Andrew Jackson. Most Eastern tribes were removed from the East into what is modern day Oklahoma. Many of you know this as the Trail of Tears. Congress also passed the Department of Indian Affairs Act in 1834. Then we see the gold rushes, both California and South Dakota. The U.S. Cavalry accompanied the settlers during that time, not to reinforce the treaties that were made, but to protect the settlers. And then in 1871, there was a statute that Congress passed a law that prohibited federal officials from making any additional treaties. So we see the stop of treaties being made. Also, this was in 1879 when boarding schools were started beginning. And then we see the pendulum continue to swing against tribal sovereignty with the General Allotment Act that was passed in 1887. This allowed reservation, this erased reservation boundaries. It broke up land within tribal holdings to non-tribal holdings, and we get the checkerboard reservations we have now due to the General Allotment Act. And this was in an effort to force assimilation, and the Congress assumed it would take 2 generations to fully assimilate. Then there was a 1924 General Citizens Act that was passed. This allowed citizenship to extend to Native Americans born in the United States and allowed them to vote in federal but not all state elections. And this did little to improve economic or political issues of tribes, but it was an effort to part of the assimilation process. Fortunately, in 1934, the General Allotment Act was repealed, and this began the swing of the pendulum away from against tribal sovereignty. But by that time, 2/3 of all tribally owned land was either sold or surrendered deeds due to new taxes and or new paperwork. This allowed for the new era of the pendulum swinging in favor of tribal sovereignty. We see the Indian reorganization era in 1928, which was part of the old group, but its full implications had in this era. The Brookings Institute issued this report based on visits to 95 Indian reservations, revealing the conditions and issues at that time, elevating it to the national platform. As a result of that, in 1933, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs was appointed by Franklin D. Roosevelt, and that commissioner declared no interference with Indian religious life or expression will hereafter be tolerated. The cultural history of Indians in all aspects will be considered equal to that of any non-Indian group. And so we see a momentum happening, and it is furthered in 1934 by the Indian Reorganization Act, also known as Wheeler-Howard Act. This was passed to rehabilitate the Indians' economic life and to give them a chance to develop and initiate their own sovereignty and over land. And this have its roots in numerous positive impacts regarding land holdings, roads, homes, health, schools, water, and even BIA employment. The pendulum swings from in favor back to against during this era known as the termination era between 1953 to 1968. The House passed a resolution. Dwight D. Eisenhower was president and abandoned all the goals that IRA has established. Under the Hoover Commission, calling for complete integration of Indians into society. Congress eliminated, quote, as rapidly as possible, unquote, the federal government's trust relationship, federal benefits, federal support services, and terminated around 109 tribes, eliminating reservations, surrendering all lands, and gave full jurisdiction to the states in an effort to assimilate tribes into American society. Then we see 1953, Public Law 280, what is commonly known. Congress sought to reduce its financial obligations. So reduce its land obligations, and now it tried to reduce its financial obligations to tribes that were not terminated. This gave 6 states, Alaska, California, Minnesota, Nebraska, Oregon, Wisconsin, criminal jurisdiction over Indian reservations. And then there was, in 1956, Public Law number 959. And this relocation program offered job training, housing assistance to Indians who were willing to leave the reservation. Although it was good in word, it was not good in action, as awarded jobs and housing was rarely awarded. Then the pendulum swings back in favor of tribes. We see tribal self-determination era between 1968 to what is present day. There's the numerous presidential statements. In 1969, President Lyndon B. Johnson declared, "We must affirm the rights of the first Americans to remain Indians while exercising their rights as Americans. We must affirm their rights to freedom of choice and self-determination." In 1970, President Nixon said this then must be the goal of any new national policy towards the Indian people, to strengthen the Indian sense of autonomy without threatening his sense of community. In 1938, President Ronald Reagan said this administration intends to restore tribal governments to their rightful place among governments of this nation, and to enable tribal governments, along with state and local governments, to resume control over their own affairs. And also, Public Law 280 was revisited and was limited, limiting the state's authority over Indian reservations, and this new requirement required the consent of the tribe. And it went on to restore terminated tribes after that. Not only that, but we also see several executive orders. In 1994, President Bill Clinton required all federal agencies to conduct business with Indian tribes on a government-to-government basis, respectful of their sovereignty. And again in 2000, the right of Indian tribes to self-government, and that requires federal agencies to work to protect tribal trust resources and Indian tribal treaty and other rights. And again, another executive order in 2009 by President Barack Obama required federal agencies to engage in meaningful consultation with tribal governments prior to taking any action that may impact tribes' interests. And a side note, President Obama was the first president to convene a meeting of every single representative from every federally recognized tribe within the country. And again, that's to give you kind of a more foundational understanding of everything that we're going to be discussing from here on out. This includes federal recognition status. This leads us to a polling question.
Okay, thank you, Ethan. So our second question here, we did have someone ask the question, how do I vote? You should be able to either click with your mouse or touch the screen for some of these answers. So go ahead and have at it. Okay, we'll end this question in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here's the results.
All right, the question was, how many federally recognized tribes are there in the US? This was also kind of a quick or trick question. They're all technically right, but in different ways. 229 is how many ethnically, culturally, and linguistically different diverse nations are located in Alaska alone. And so 365 was a popular Native American effort led by a Native American photographer to photograph every tribe in the United States. And so that was a well-known Native American effort. 400 is the amount of non-federally recognized tribes within the US. And then if you guess 574, which 55% of you did, you are correct. There are technically 574 federally recognized tribes within the United States. Well, as of now. Next, we see tribal terms. I put an asterisk there because it varies, but this is generally speaking. There's tribalette, which is a small little tribe that has a centralized village, and they have outlying villages that they kind of visit from time to time. And so that is a terminology that some may not be familiar with. It's more common here in California. Then there's clan. Clan is often kind of seen as a subset of a tribe. It is often referred to as a multi-generational social group within a tribe. And again, the term varies according to tribe, but that's the most common one. So you have several clans within a tribe, and a tribe is a general term used for a social group that shares a common language, culture, kinship, territory, history, and even a common purpose. Then you have a confederated tribe, which is seen as just as there can be numerous clans within a tribe, a confederate tribe is made up of several tribes. A political union of two or more tribes. And we see this in several cases here in California, where several tribes were placed on one reservation, and together they make up a confederated tribe. Then there's historic and non-historic tribes. Historic generally refers to that tribe that has a history of that common language, culture, kinship, territory, history, and purpose, while a non-historic tribe was created under the Indian Reorganization Act. Tribal status. Tribes are commonly broken up into three categories: what is known as federally recognized, state recognized, and otherwise not specified. Federally, what determines this recognition goes back to treaty making process. For a treaty to become valid after it's signed by the US, a tribal government representatives must sign it, and it must be sent back to DC for approval or to be ratified by Congress. All treaties have gone through that process. Sovereignty status for Indian tribes, the US only negotiates treaties with sovereign entities. So for Congress to have treaties with tribes shows that tribes are indeed sovereign entities. The US may expand or contract its recognition of tribal sovereign authority, but only by Congress. Congress has ratified 374 treaties, and this shows the sovereign status of tribes. Well, what technically qualifies as a federal recognized tribe? Well, according to the BIA, an American Indian or Alaskan Native tribal entity that is recognized as having a government-to-government relationship with the United States, with the responsibilities, powers, limitations, obligations attached to that designation, and is eligible for funding and services from the BIA. Then there's state recognized. Here in California, Native American Indian tribes and nations and heritage groups that have been recognized by a process established under the state laws for varying purposes. Many states have passed their own legislation to recognize some tribes and acknowledge self-determination for numerous historic ethnic groups. and community historic ethnic groups. However, officially on record, California has not recognized any state recognized tribes. However, there is a caveat to that. CNA for short. The state has passed 2 laws recognizing non-federally recognized tribes, elevating it to state recognized level. And due to time, I won't read those laws, but the first one applies to holding conservation easements, and the second one is due to consultation process for SB 18, AB 52, and Section 106. And so we see that California takes a unique approach in elevating tribes to a certain status within these 2 laws. Part of the recognition process, because I get asked all the time, how does a tribe get recognized? We talked briefly about the states, but here's a federal. It takes an act of Congress to recognize a tribe or a decision of the U.S. court. It's also part of the Office of Federal Acknowledgement, and it is a rigorous process. There's a 84-page guideline that lays out a 7-point criteria that all 7 points have to be met in order for Congress to even consider a tribe for recognition status. And so this is something that tribes go through in order to be recognized that aren't currently already recognized.
Ethan, I have 2 questions just for clarity purposes.
Okay.
Can you give an example of a confederated tribe in California?
Yes. Round Valley is seen as a confederated tribe due to 5 tribes being located on that reservation. That's also where Coville is, for those of you who know. And that's up here in the Northern California part. For an example, they have Simpomo, they have Wailaki tribe. Those are the 2 I can think of off the top of my head, but there's 5 tribes there, so that's one.
Maybe a similar question is the Pomo Indians are grouped in bands, the Coyote Band of Pomo Indians. How does that relate to the terms you used earlier?
Correct. So some have the same blood, ethnicity, for lack of better terms, but have different cultures. For an example, you have a coastal way of life and you have an inland way of life. And so that would qualify as 2 different kinds of bands, or could qualify. And so that draws a distinction. Pomo has quite a few bands here in California, spread throughout the state. And that's kind of an example of it for clarity purposes. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And then Bob Ulibarri mentions the Gabrielino Tanba tribe of California is state recognized tribe by proclamation.
Thank you for that, Bob. I'll add that to my notes. Next is the structure and function, which is the polling question.
Okay, do you work or interact with tribal governments? Okay, it looks like activity has ended, so I'll end the poll. Here's the results.
All right, 67% said yes often, 26% said yes rarely, 4% said no, and 4% said not yet. I like that optimism, which is why I added that in there. Thank you for your feedback on that. All right. Next, I want to continue on the tribal structure and function. Before I want to talk about the structure of tribal government, I want to touch on the structure of tribal society. In Navajo, we have 4 laws: the natural law, traditional law, common law, and customary law. As you can see, tribal society is overarching, and this is an oversimplified explanation, but it shows kind of the different groups. The cultural realm is kind of led by the elders and cultural experts. Political realm is led by general council, tribal council. The spiritual realm is led by medicine men and women and spiritual experts. And I'll only be talking about the political realm. So we're drawing a separation of distinction, and we see this also in American society as well. The political realm doesn't overrule on the other realms as well. And something I want to mention before I continue is the kind of different ways of thinking. Um, in the US, we kind of think in terms of days. Russian culture thinks in terms of decades. Native Americans usually generally think in terms of generations. And China generally thinks in terms of centuries. And that's kind of different our ways of thinking. And I wanted to mention that, and it ties in with something I'll mention later on. But it best fits here in tribal society. United States of American government. Many of you are familiar with our structure. We have the US Constitution and the different branches of federal government. We have the legislative branch by Congress, laid out in Article 1, which is in charge of creating laws. We have the executive branch, which is the US President, laid out in Article 2, which is in charge of enforcing the law. Then we have judicial branch, which is our federal courts, and that's laid out in Article 3, and their job is to interpret the laws. And so we see that there's a struggle of maintaining and creating good versus bad laws and maintaining good versus bad, the status quo and in between, regardless of which way the political winds blow. Each have their own functions and purpose, and we have what's called the separation of powers. And many of you are familiar with this, but what many may not know is that the current structure of the US government has its roots in tribal government. Many of you know that Benjamin Franklin was one of the architects of current day structure, and he was the chair of the Indian Affairs Committee when it was founded. And he discussed often with tribal people their governments. And he took this model from the Iroquois League of 5 Nations and implemented, and it was modified to this version, but it has its roots in tribal government, for those who aren't familiar with that. And this leads us to tribal governments. I put an asterisk there because this is generally, there are exceptions, but there's the tribal constitution, the general council, the tribal government. You have the legislative branch, which creates laws, which is typically the tribal council. You have the executive branch, which is typically the chairperson. It could be chairman, chairwoman, principal, chief, governor, president, mayor, spokesperson, representative. There's all kinds of different terms that are used. And in some tribes, the tribal council is also part of the executive branch, either in partnership with the chairperson or entirely. And their job is to enforce the laws. And then the judicial branch, which is tribal courts, and again, to interpret the laws. Tribal courts have been growing, both civil and criminal. And then there's that factor of Public Law 280. And there's also cross-deputization, which also plays a role. But regarding tribal courts, I won't touch too much on that today. That could be something for a future topic. It is definitely extensive on, um, you know, judges, the requirements, election of judges, or appointment. And I mentioned the law affects whether it's a non-native, whether the perpetrator is native, the victim is native, whether the perpetrator is native, victim is non-native, whether the perpetrator is non-native and the victim is native, or the perpetrator is non-native and the victim is non-native. Whether it happens on trust land, whether it happens on fee land, whether it happens within the boundary of the reservation, these all play a role. And again, that could be a discussion for possibly another time. Continuing on with tribal governments, to kind of give you a better idea, General Council is made up of all enrolled members, unless they're stripped of their privileges. They each get a vote. Then they have meetings. Typically, they're annual meetings. I know many tribes that meet more than annual. I know of one tribe that meets monthly. Their general council, all the members meet together. Under them are the tribal council. They are elected representatives, typically from every district. They vary in size according to tribe. It's common to have 8 or 5, somewhere around there. The Lawton Nation, which I'm an enrolled member of, we have a tribal government of 38. And so it just goes to show that size varies according to the tribe. They have an annual rotation. Their typical terms are around 3 years. Some have term limits, some don't. So about a third of the council rotates off. They have meetings as well. They meet monthly. I know of a tribe that their tribal council meets weekly. It varies. These are just general, just to give you kind of an idea. The chairperson is elected. Again, the term varies and term limits vary, but typically they're elected for a 3-year term. Some tribes have, again, it varies according to tribes. You can see that the council and the chairperson has a high turnover rate sometimes, depending on term limit, which in your case could be good or bad. Because if you maintain good relationships, if there's a high rotation, then eventually you have good relationships with quite a few people. If you make a mistake, the high turnover rate can help you kind of start over and mend that relationship. It could be a fresh start. And so we see that if a decision in your project requires a chairperson decision, which is often rare, but can happen from time to time, but often requires a tribal council decision, you can see that they meet monthly. And if it's a huge, like a land use plan that requires a general council vote, you may be looking at an annual timetable, depending on the tribe. So this is something to keep in mind in regard to tribal government structure and relationship with the tribe, and how it may affect you. Then there's tribal departments. Just like the US has numerous departments under the executive branch, the tribal departments usually work at the direction under the chairperson. You may be familiar with these different departments that you work with, the planning or environmental department. Many tribes are beginning to expand their planning department. There, of course, is the cultural and the TIPO and the self-governance department is one that's very important that you'll work with. And the tarot office, insurance compliance, maybe you'll work with the housing authority, which is often separate and its own entity. Some tribes have a joint housing authority that they partner with together, and they pool their resources and funds and projects accordingly. So some important questions that you may have are, who is authorized to speak for the tribe? You might be working with someone who works in a department, not in the tribal council. And so it's important to remember what authority within the tribe they have, and also you yourself, whether you're an employee, whether you're a project manager, whether you have a larger role within your firm or agency or organization. And it also shows who you might work with. And understand that federal funding limits might also apply. Tribes work with a very limited budget, which is clearly outlined in some of their contracts, that projects you have to abide by strict budgets as well. And they may be working with grants or specific funds. And if they go beyond that, they may have to require a vote to pull from the general fund or something like that, just so that you are aware in working with tribal governments.
Ethan, we have a question about business councils, how they fit within that organization.
That's different according to tribe. Tribes create business councils for the tribal purposes and give them different authorities, whether it be like equivalent to a committee or whether it's completely separate from the tribal council and deals with all the funds, which happens from time to time. And so it depends on the tribe. But it is a unique category that varies. It'd be similar to a housing authority. It can be under the tribe, it could be removed. And Robert Ulibarri said it's also remnants of the IRA, Indian Reorganization Act. And moving on to source and limitations, there are, where does tribal governments draw its source of power? Just like any tribal government or any government, from the people. And this has been since time immemorial. We see a Supreme Court verdict there in 2002 that Indian tribes are neither states nor part of the federal government, nor subdivisions of either. Rather, they are sovereign political entities possessed of sovereign authority not derived from the United States, which they predate. Indian tribes are qualified to exercise powers of self-government by reason or of their original tribal sovereignty. And so we see the US doesn't establish power or authority, but rather they recognize what is already in existence. And actually the US is burdened with preserving it. And we see another Supreme Court verdict in 1832 that Indian nations have always been considered a distinct independent political communities, retaining their own original natural rights as the undisputed professors of the soil. The very term nation, so generally applied to them, means a people distinct from other. And I threw this in here, that it's even included in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, that the federal government regulates commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes. So they're distinct. They're specifically pointed out, even in the Constitution. It's also important to note that tribes are not limited nor bound by the US Constitution. This was a Supreme Court determination in 1869 that tribes predate the Constitution. And so that comes to a surprise to many who don't know that already. Limitations of power. Congress has plenary authority to limit, modify, or even eliminate the powers of local self-governments, which we briefly covered in the intro of overview of the history. And this is commonly known as the plenary power doctrine. And it has been interpreted that the founders wished to safeguard Indian sovereignty by this plenary power doctrine. Next, we see the express and implied limitations. There are limitations. Tribes cannot sell land without federal government's permission. This leads to what is commonly known as the 99-year lease. Instead of selling it, they'll lease it for 99 years. And after 99 years, it goes back to the rightful ownership of the family. Tribes can no longer create armies. Tribes can no longer declare war on a foreign government, and tribes can't exercise certain powers over non-Indians. These are express and implied limitations due from the treaties and the federal government. But tribes have a unique status. Indian tribes occupy a unique position within U.S. society, unlike any other political entity in the U.S. And the U.S. Supreme Court has described Indian tribes as quasi-sovereign, semi-dependent in 1886, and possessing attributes of sovereignty over both their members and their territory, while being subject to plenary power of Congress, 1975. Although these are words from the Supreme Court, tribes have about an 80% loss rate within the Supreme Court, with most of the favorable verdicts taking place within the last 20 years. And this also shows in water rights as well. There have been some recent Supreme Court verdicts recently, and we can touch on those at the end if we have time. But I also want to touch on the scope of powers. Tribes have the right to form a government. Tribes have all of these rights to regulate tribal membership, tribal land, individual owned land, criminal jurisdiction, civil jurisdiction, domestic relations, the right to engage in and regulate commerce and trade. But the federal government also has a scope of powers, and it is all of these. They have the right to administration of Indian affairs, to regulate tribal governments, to terminate tribes, to regulate tribal memberships, tribal land, tribal assets, individual property, trade, and liquor, to exercise criminal jurisdiction. And because this always comes up, I always get asked, I included one slide on tribal gaming. For those who don't know, tribal gaming is one of the most heavily regulated industries in the US. There are tribal level, which is regulated by the Constitution, the tribe's Constitution, and the tribe's own gaming commission. Then there is the state level, which requires a federally approved tribal state compact. Then there's the federal level, which includes the National Gaming Commission, and numerous departments are involved in this, including the Department of Justice, the Treasury Department, Department of Interior. And there are different classes of gaming license, Class 1, Class 2, Class 3. And this is, Congress also passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act in 1988. And so this, I don't want to spend too much time on this. I can spend a whole hour on this, but I just wanted to throw that in there because it does exercise tribal sovereignty within tribal land. Some related agencies include the BIA, you might work with, the Indian Health Services, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which you'll probably get guidance from. They provide really, really good guiding documents. Native American Heritage Commission here in California, and every federal and state agencies have tribal liaisons, which work with. And if there is a contract dispute, usually within the agreement, it goes to the tribal courts and it can go to the federal court. And so these are some agencies that you might work with. How are we doing on time?
5 minutes.
As we begin to wrap this up, best practices. Tribes on domestic sovereign self-government nations. Tribes have a nation-to-nation relationship with the U.S. State governments have very limited power over tribes within reservations. A brief recap over this. I'm going to gloss over this because of time. To remember and understand tribe status, to read the Constitution and bylaws. Tribes have their own consultation policy. Maybe your agency or firm or organization has a tribal consultation policy. Then there's remember the tribal government or department to build a relationship with a tribe, regardless if you need something or not. Tribal lands, this will be the future topic that we'll go more in depth on, but understanding tribal jurisdiction, rancherias, reservation, tribal authority, fee land, trust land, restricted fee. That's a future topic we'll discuss on October 13th. Then there's tribal consultation, formal and informal, AB 52, SB 18, Section 106, and numerous executive orders here in California. And there is a purpose and an outcome to consultation. This will be a future topic, but is also a result of tribal sovereignty. We'll also talk about conflict resolution, how to deal with a bump in the road, how to best move forward, when is the appropriate time to end consultation, and who gets to determine that. Proper mitigation, archaeological surveys, 1, 2, and 3, cultural resources, tribal cultural resources, trust assets, TIPO, SHIPO, cultural director, cultural monitors, all of these you'll be working with in your project due to tribal sovereignty. And tribal confidentiality, sacred lands, resources, different levels of confidentiality. I categorize these into 3 groups. The first one is proper, which is the absolute minimum required by law. I included privilege and private, which are above and beyond the minimum requirement by law. And I categorize these as ethical and moral, and all of these play a role in communications and in publications, all due to tribal sovereignty. And due to time, the polling question, was this presentation informative? Was it helpful? And as we begin to wind down this presentation.
So we're going to end after this, right, Ethan? You'll have an
Yes.
informational slide, but you're going to continue on with a couple topics if people want to hang on.
Yes.
And you were just teasing us on those last 5 slides for you're making a commitment to having future webinars on those topics.
And each of those are best practice for tribal sovereignty.
Great. Okay, well, we'll end the polling in a couple of seconds, so jump in there. And here are the results.
44% said yes, very. 20% said yes. 48% said I wish there was more time, and I agree, I wish there was more time. 4% said info I already knew, thanks for sharing. All right, well with that, if you have another time commitment, I completely understand. I thank you for joining us. And again, I had to glaze over so much due to time. Feel free to shoot me any emails with any questions. If you have additional comments, feel free to email them to me as well or call me. I'd love to talk to you more about any of this. And again, I could talk about this all day. If you have more time, I can take a few questions, or we could talk about these recent Supreme Court determinations and how it relates to tribal sovereignty. But if you have to go, I understand. All right. I'm not sure if there are any questions.
One question had to do with the Oklahoma case. I think you're going to discuss.
All right. So those of you who are still in it to win it, let's go. The recent one, which you may have heard of, is the Oklahoma case, McGritt versus Oklahoma. This case was started in 1997 by an enrolled member of the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma. This case is a very sad and disturbing case, and I hope it gets appropriately settled in the federal courts. But it brought up a reservation dispute, whether the Creek Reservation continued to exist after Oklahoma became a state. Oklahoma became a state in 1907. And this, the Supreme Court looked at the treaty. The U.S. made a treaty with the Creeks in February 14, 1833. And if you remember in the history survey, there was the Indian Removal Act, and part of the relocation process that covers this period. And part of the statement from the Supreme Court included, because Congress has not said otherwise, we hold the government to its word. In other words, a Supreme Court determined, and this is a brief summary paraphrase, that the federal court, nor did Congress, nor other federal entity abolished the reservations. That is actually the state that did, and unrightfully so. And so the Supreme Court said only Congress can do that, as we've covered before. And so they restored that, and only federal can prosecute within that jurisdiction. And this verdict has implications ranging from zoning to taxation to family to environmental law. It has so much impact on roughly 47% of Oklahoma. Some 1.8 million people live in that portion. About 50% of them are Native American and live on that land. And there are joint statements from 5 tribes in Oklahoma: the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and Muskeek, who welcome the ruling. And they said they pledged to work with federal and state authorities to agree shared jurisdiction over the land. And they stated that the nations and the state are committed to implementing a framework of shared jurisdiction that will preserve sovereign interests and rights to self-government while affirming jurisdictional understandings, procedures, laws, and regulations that support public safety, our economy, and private property rights. And part of the statement was, today we are asked whether these treaties promise remains an Indian reservation for purposes of federal criminal law, and because Congress has not otherwise stated, we hold the government to its word. And I included a brief video for your enjoyment, or before the video is this picture. It shows the Indian Territory boundaries in 1889. And so we see pretty much all of it is designated for tribal use. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but this was no man's land due to disputes in the states and ownership. And the only non-tribal land was here and here. Other than that, and here. Other than that, all of these were designated for these tribes. And before the verdict, this Osage was the only trust land, but now all of this is federal jurisdiction. And here's the brief video. It includes a process of how the US states kind of came into play, and I want you to keep an eye not only on everything. The gray is ownership of other countries. I mentioned Spain before. And the orange, which are territories, which, as you know, in American history, a territory is part of the process of becoming a state, and then state, and then of course red is disputed areas. So I started the video, and I want you to keep an eye on Oklahoma. And part of this is the Indian Removal Act, which is the Mississippi. All of the tribes east of the Mississippi were relocated into what is modern day Oklahoma. So all of these territories are being controlled by the colonies. And this is a condensed timetable. You can see the dates at the bottom. Slowly, these changes are happening. And right here is where you'll see modern day Oklahoma. So tribes are being pushed westward, and they're being funneled into this area. This time, the different gold rushes and all that stuff. Here's Indian Territory. So this is where all the tribes are being put. And as you can see, all the states, this was a civil war. All the territories and states are taking shape. Civil War ended, still Indian Territory. And as all the states, as you can see, Oklahoma became the state late in the game. And boom, Oklahoma became a state. And so this was kind of for your benefit to see kind of that whole process of tribes being relocated to Oklahoma and how that affected everything in the Supreme Court decision with the treaties and sovereignty. And yeah. Oh, this is another slide. If you guys still have time, I touched on the Dakota Access Pipeline case. Also a Supreme Court decision hinged on tribal sovereignty and land. Those of you who are still in there, hanging on in there, this project began in 2016. The Obama administration denied the permits in December 2016. The Trump administration granted the permits in June 2017. Standing Rock Sioux Tribe challenged it in court. It made its way up to federal court, and on March 25th, the federal court ruled that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had violated NEPA by grossly over minimizing the devastating consequences of potential oil spill. And on July 6th, which was recent, the federal judge issued a halt order to shut down the oil in the pipeline by August 5th during the environmental review, which could take up to 13 months, which many of you are familiar with that process. This goes to show that the weight that tribal land and sovereignty plays in the role. This has to do with proper tribal consultation, section 106, and proper consideration of trust assets and sacred sites due to proper mitigations considered under NEPA. This includes drinking water, burial, and prayer sites. And I included some pictures for your visual purposes. As you can see, the United States down here. The red line is the pipeline. The green line is all tribal reservations. And here's a point of Standing Rock protest site. And you can see the pipeline right there. And the reason this plays a role is Standing Rock had a larger reservation that this pipeline crosses over, and this is seen in this next picture. You can see the green was the former reservation that was granted according to trust or to treaty, lost some in 1989 and lost some more in 1910, and the red is current. But the pipeline runs right through here, and so it just goes to show that tribal sovereignty continues to play a role even in current day events. In your line of work, as well as tribal sovereignty in numerous realms: consultation, confidentiality, trust resources, mitigations, and everything we have talked about today. So I hope that this gives you a broad foundation of tribal sovereignty and why things are the way they are. And again, future topics will go more in depth on those other topics mentioned. Yeah, and again, here's my contact information. and I'd love to hear from you. Any questions, comments, concerns, any way I can be of assistance, let me know. Any way I can provide further clarity on any items, be more than happy to.
Great, thank you, Ethan. So we'll wrap this up, and thank you all for joining us. Be in contact with our future brown bag lunches, which are typically the second Tuesday of the month. So we'll see you again soon.
And if you want to email me, I can send you the PowerPoint, a redacted version of it, and I could send you a certificate saying you attended. So shoot me an email.
Great. All right, see you all.